All right, I think we're going to go ahead and try to get started. A little bit late, but we're on a tight schedule, so we're going to try to keep to it. I first want to welcome all of you to the first annual Doctor of Design Symposium. This is the first of what we hope is going to become a reoccurring event each year, talking about different topics surrounding research and design, specifically tied to the Doctor of Design program. We want to thank the Doctor of Design program, the Advanced Studies program, the Design Robotics group, and the Critical Digital Student group for sponsorship of this event, and specifically Professors Antoine Picone, Martin Bechtold, Michael Hayes, and along with Barbara Elfman and Maria Moran for helping make this possible. Also the team of co-chairs, which is a collection of DDES students, Matan Meyer here, who you'll hear from later, Terne Meshkani, which is here, Demetrius Papanikolaou, I think I got it right, and Andy Payne, who's not able to be here today. So I wanted to first, I'll talk a little bit about the DDES program. It's a rigorous research program embedded in the design school that kind of differentiates itself from PhD programs at other universities, specifically through rigorous kind of professional research that's tied to practice in a way. Some of us look at theoretical pursuits, some of us look at applied research dealing with technology development, implementation, and a wide range of things. The curriculum for the DDES is customizable, so it kind of tailors to fit each individual student's needs and really focuses on research and whatever trajectory they're interested in throughout the university and the Cambridge community. We all approach things differently, but there's a key thing that ties us all together, and that's rigor in the research that we pursue. There's kind of a trajectory for some DDES to enter into academia for teaching. Some populate practice and really become kind of major impact in developing new models of practice, and kind of disruptive technologies have emerged from the DDES program. So a lot of the research that's kind of emerges does carry into some practices. So the key topic that we want to talk about today is really how research plays into practice and the role of research within practice, specifically interested in questions of how research can become a fiscal viable construct within the design practice and how different modes of practice approach research. That's essentially, so I invited a few colleagues to come to this event, and I constantly got questions back that ask, like, what is research? And that's after several emails and internal discussions, arguments, and kind of heated conversations between our organizing committee. We kind of arrived at no answer. We're not really sure what research means in the context of design practice. Everyone defines it differently. You hear the term design research, which means a very specific thing to certain people. In the context of architecture, this may or may not mean rigorous evidence-based research. It may simply mean the design process, which is iterative, based on informed decision-making, evaluation, iteration, and then decision-making, which results in a final product. So all of these things kind of diagrammatically fall into the context of research as a mode of practice. And we're going to try to get at the bottom of that through examples of practice that incorporate some type of research from local practitioners to kind of bring these questions to head and try to get some conclusion. My gut feeling is that we're going to kind of arrive at more questions, but at least present several different perspectives of how this can be applied. And so we can keep on schedule. I'm going to introduce Matan Meyer, who's going to go over the symposium logistics and the mechanics of the event and introduce the first speaker. So thank you for coming.
Thanks, Nathan. So the evening would consist of 3 different parts. We have 2 panels, followed by a keynote lecture. And the way we curated the panels deals with the way we see design as practice, and also the work that these firms do. The first panel looks more at you could call it the object scale. So it would be material explorations or construction techniques, things that really have to do with the built environment in a human scale. The second panel looks at a more systematic approach that can be interpreted either through urban design, larger interventions, or also consulting to different services, to different service providers. Each speaker will speak for around 10 minutes, and each 3 speakers in a panel would then join for around a 30-minute moderated discussion. In the moderated discussion, please feel free to participate and to ask questions. All of the firms, or most of the firms that we brought in today are local firms, except Snoheta. So we hope that the evening would really show the diversity of the Boston design scene, or the design practices around Boston. And I'll go ahead and start introducing the speakers. And since you have, hopefully most of you have their bios right in front of you in that handout that we placed in the entrance, I'll introduce the speakers through their firms rather than through their own accomplishments, since the evening really deals with practices and how research is done in practice. So our first speaker tonight is Matthew Trimble. Matt is the founder and principal of RadLab, a multidisciplinary design and fabrication consulting firm located here in Boston. The scope of the firm's work includes architecture, design computing, digital fabrication, and product development. Matt, please. This is how you move the slides.
Okay. There we go. Yeah, it's working. Little problem with the pointer, but I'm sure we'll figure it out. So I'd like to just read a few initial comments, and then we'll just discuss the work as we go. The projects I'm going to present will be discussed in a manner that tries to target the research components. As a result, the projects will not necessarily be shown in the sort of typical manner of full disclosure with their overall intentions and conclusions. I'm going to start by showing our office, which is the image you see up on the screen, including a few small experimental installations for the office. We'll look at furniture, some shoes, some medical device work. Good. And conclude with some recent academic research. For this presentation, I'm going to pull away from explicitly architectural research, but I hope you'll find that our approach to these projects remains deeply rooted in architecture. Our aim in this context is to employ research in order to cultivate novel solutions in the construction of buildings and products. On the one hand, we think of research as a cornerstone, intended to anchor our work in cultural discourse, history, nature, philosophy, reality, and to serve as a framework of accountability for making decisions throughout the design process. Research is also put into practice as a kind of capstone, in as many cases as possible, allowing us to ask questions about the results of a project and probe its utility, effectiveness, and impact, which often becomes a springboard for the next project. So I think of our office as a canvas for experimentation, where mistakes and error are welcome and even programmed into our process of thinking, designing, making. The majority of these intra-office experiments that I'm going to show you are done with residual materials from projects and prototypes, or in some cases with found materials or free materials. The projects serve as outlets for ideas and interests that couldn't be sufficiently resolved or explored within the context of a project because of its own constraints and limitations. So, the first image that I want to show you is sort of the history of the office. We're currently located in Charlestown, and the space that we're in used to be a dress factory. So it was where Priscilla of Boston was located for about 65 years. The building is roughly 30,000 square feet, and we occupy about 3,000 square feet of that. The space that we occupy used to be basically the storage, the excess space for Priscilla of Boston. So the images, if you look at the upper left image, that's currently our studio. The big opening that you see sort of in the center of the image is a big white garage door that rolls up. This is where we enter the space. Above that, there's a clerestory kind of push out in the roof that brings in light from all the way around the space. On the right-hand side, you see a lot of the storage of the previous tenant in the space. So the way that we decided to occupy the space, because we are an office that is so concerned with issues of fabrication and making, was to basically subdivide the space according to a studio, which in many cases serves as a kind of buffer between areas that can be allowed to have dust and areas where we really don't want dust. And so we have these four compartments within the office that we try to use to move back and forth very quickly between design and fabrication. So we have what we call the clean lab, which is on the end of the office. That's where we do things like laser cutting, thermoforming, electronics. We have our design lab, or our studio, which is the red space. That acts as that buffer, and that's where things like the bathroom, the kitchen, and workspace happen. In the blue area is our basically our machine lab. That's where we do things like 6-axis robotic milling and machining. It's where we have our flatbed CNC router. Those two areas are subdivided by a dust collection system that can be allocated to either side of the space. And then the last area is our wood lab, which is basically a traditional wood shop partnered with this kind of conjunction, or this array of CNC tools. So we basically started by whitewashing the interior and pouring a new topping slab. We subdivided the space sort of down the middle, which is the wall on the left that is the only floor-to-ceiling wall in the whole space. So it's basically one large open volume. And this one floor-to-ceiling wall actually is broken up in the middle where the clerestory is, so the light from that clerestory is entirely dedicated to the studio space. So the wall that you see roughly in the middle of the image is kind of dividing the fabrication space on the left and the studio space on the right. So there are a few very bite-sized little experimental projects that I'll show you that give you a taste of how we view the office. It's sort of a posture about the kind of work that we do, but more importantly, the kind of research that we're interested in, which is an ongoing kind of constant wrestling with materials, with machines, with design techniques, and all of the above. So the first thing is a screen, basically a photography backdrop that's made out of entirely found materials, and by that I mean every single part of it. So if you look closely, the top of it is made out of machined masonite with a bicycle sprocket and bicycle chain. That's connected by a threaded rod to another sprocket that goes down to a crank. And this enables us to use a very large piece of rolled canvas paper to view projected work and also serve as a backdrop for photography. Coat rack, a CNC cabinet that we can store things like collets, bits, tools, cabinet space, storage space for shelving and books. In conjunction with this work, we've been seeing more need for material samples that demonstrate the materiality of parts that are birthed through the process of digital design processes and fabrication. So I'll show you 4 quick samples that are all material manifestations of the same digital model. So this is white oak that you're looking at, unfinished. This is a Baltic birch with a water-based polyacrylic. This is MDF, one side unfinished, one side painted with a primer filler and an automotive paint. And then an American birch with an oil-based polyurethane. The next project is reused materials. This is all kind of reclaimed plywood that we use to make a toddler bed for a client. The idea was we were kind of pairing reclaimed materials with a research agenda we had about kind of testing one of these machines to understand really its benefits within the context of architecture and industrial design. So the idea was to force this machine to do what none of the other tools we had at our disposal could do, which was machining the entire inside of this kind of channel at once. So pre-assembling the parts and machining it in one go so you get maximum clarity and continuity in the materiality of the final product. Next project is a competition that we're working on currently. This is for the Fort Point bench. So we entered a competition that you may be familiar with in the Fort Point channel. Design Museum Boston is hosting it. The materials that we used are all reclaimed, used materials. They're from this paper mill in Holyoke, Mass. These are some of the materials that we kind of looked through, all reclaimed from the paper mill actually caught on fire last March. The building was unoccupied for years. It was dilapidated. They demolished the building, but they saved a lot of the spruce joists that at this point are about 130 years old. And that's the material we use to make our bench. Really beautiful material. So the outside of this material has been aging forever, and so it's got this very dark finish. But then when you go and you start machining that wood, you get a much softer finish. So we thought it would be interesting to explore that, looking at things like erosion and thinking about starting with kind of the solid prism, similar to the previous piece of furniture that you sort of erode from to arrive at the final product. This gives you a sense of the process. The next bit of research has to do with panelization. So we're basically thinking about two lines of thought regarding panelization. One is we have a predetermined piece of geometry. It could be anything, a doubly curved surface or a flat plane. We want to describe it with flat panels, and so we come up with a way of solving that problem through algorithmic means. The other is a notion that you can take a set of parts that, if they have sufficient flexibility, can make virtually anything. So a set of pieces with dynamic mechanical joints that enable a designer to actually create in real time with the physical parts, rather than having a predetermined solution on hand. So these images show you one manifestation of a system that allows for flexible joining and clipping in multiple locations so that you can configure in an ad hoc fashion. And then these next images show you basically the idea of a preconceived form or volume or space that you're trying to define using these flat stock materials. The previous one is a 5-foot-tall sculpture. This is all just laser cut chipboard, very simple. This is shoji screen, Japanese shoji screen, basically rice paper. A recent project that we've done that's all research is for New Balance, basically taking massive data sets like this that they're getting. Do I need to finish up? Okay, so I'll wrap up quickly. Massive data sets that come from pressure sensors in an athlete's foot. So they're working with Olympic athletes, bringing them into their biomechanics lab and trying to understand how they run and how their foot hits a surface based on the specific nature of their body. So we're taking those data sets and looking at a variety of lines of research that enable us to infuse form and structure with information. So from the left, you see the actual field of pressure points that have to do with vector force and direction, and that enables us to think about how to make something that is not just giving lip service to the idea of performance-based design, but actually doing it. So the first one was based on particle systems. This is based on a more web-based system, which is particularly interesting because we're trying to work with New Balance to think of ways that you can use 3D printing to develop techniques that can be made in no other way. For the last 100 years, almost every shoe that exists in the athletic world is from injection molded processes. So we're taking 3D printing parts inside of parts that have no physical connection. Only when they collide with one another do they provide resistance. A series of medical device bits of research. This is kind of a longer one, but I don't really have time to go through it. We're working with patients who suffer from two specific conditions, one more narrow than the other. Reflexive sympathetic dystrophy, which means basically you have an impaired hand and a healthy hand. You want the healthy hand to be participatory in rehabilitating the impaired hand. So we have 3 patents filed on this technology that we've developed, and we have a project or a new prototype that actually was just finished very recently. Actually, could I cue? Never mind, we don't have time for the videos. I'll keep going. A lot of the fabrication was done in-house. We're using CNC machining to develop the molds, vacuum forming casings for mechanical parts, electronics, technical drawings for the patent. Finally, just some academic research with robotic arm that we have. We've won 2 grants with the Boston Architectural College to teach courses with students at the BAC using the robotic arm in our office, thinking about things like wire cutting, pick and place operations, and weaving. This is our office before we moved into Charlestown back in the seaport. And then a final project, if I could just go ahead and cue the last video, video 4. This is a more recent class that I taught last spring, working with students to develop this reconfigurable wall. So basically the idea is you create a matrix of 16 simple panels, and you can reconfigure them to describe these very different conditions. And we're looking at 3 specific conditions that the video will show. This this research project was actually exhibited at the BSA. So we're working with EPS foam, expanded polystyrene, a highly recyclable material, very, very light. So the wall that we're building basically is about 20 pounds, so any individual person could literally pick up the entire wall. So it's less about the architectural materialization, but more about the concept of this reconfigurable wall and how it can affect and impact space. So the first configuration about gradient, students come back, they disassemble it, reconfigure it. The way they know how to configure it, there are QR codes on every module. So all they have to do is scan the module with their cell phone, and that tells them the configuration that it goes in.
I know what got you eat. You have to shut your eyes. Sleep ambulance. Crows. Don't have to wonder why you're so tired.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Matt. The next speaker is Alex Anmanian. I hope I'm saying it correctly. Alex is a principal and founding partner of Anmanian Winton Architects, an architecture firm based in Cambridge. Perhaps best known for the community rowing boathouse around here. The firm has completed projects in multiple scales and programs over the last 2 decades. AW's body of work is characterized by an ongoing exploration of detailing, innovative assembly, and construction techniques. Alex.
How do I work this? Okay, got it. Thank you. I unfortunately don't have any music to entertain you with, but I'll try my best. I have this image for the first slide, and I refer to this as design, research design, because I'm equally as confused about the separation or distinction between them. But if we refer to it as design research, for us it's, of course, a progressive approximation of whatever it is that we happen to be working on at whatever scale. We find that there's a kind of reciprocity between design and research, that first we imbue an object. I think we create first, which incites research usually, and then we toil in a realm, I think, that we consider research, which then feeds back into the object of design. And so that process for us is ongoing and constant. And I'm not sure exactly what the distinction is, because we're in the midst of it. But for us, it involves building form, construction assemblies, material qualities, fabrication methods, programmatic requirements, regulatory limits, physical and cultural contexts, etc., all of which we view in not a negative sense as contingencies on our profession or as designers that we have to be responsive to, obviously. I think in the end for us, we do create artifacts, whether they are abstract or concrete, and I'll look at some in process. I'm going to only look at 2 projects and to look at a range of aspects between kind of regulatory issues and design detail. But ultimately, as I said, the research is embodied in the object of design. It's deliberate and unpredictable. It's practical and speculative simultaneously. It's always project-based in terms of its inception, but we tend to generalize because it always finds itself in new projects. The research, given that it's practical for us, is always context-specific, so it is unintentionally generalized. It usually just parts find their way into some other project, but each context is so peculiar and specific in terms of its contingencies that they're not a direct carryover. So we're not doing research to create knowledge in the end, where the knowledge is a result of research that is based on acting on objects as designers. We're, like I think any designer, we're confronted with unforeseen circumstances constantly, and that is, in a sense, what we do, is how we know how to respond to those. And as I said, we're dealing with a multitude of outside forces that are subjected on the project and are subject, I think, to interpretation, even regulatory constraints, which I find actually quite interesting in terms of twisting and turning those. The material research is obviously the easiest to understand, but the immaterial research and research design, I'll look at one example that we did some time ago. But in the end, what we're involved in both design research, or if you want to call it design research, is reconciliation of often contradictions, some that are imposed on us by others, and some that come from our own divergent impulses as designers. So, and this slide for me, this is a painting by Carlos Madrid. I like it because often our research is purely in, I mean, we can do research obviously in new materials, but we often are engaged in lower budget projects and reinterpreting existing materials, and that's what I find interesting about the painting. So this is a case for a think tank project in Cambridge where we designed the interview in order to research and ascertain the multi-headed client's ethos, because this was a response to their request to us to provide them with a visionary sketch, which we have a very difficult time doing when we don't understand what it is we're contending with. So it's a booklet that is an interactive interview that includes pictures and words of various things, sometimes in contradiction to one another, sometimes ambiguous. And they're codified in terms of scale and subject with the little cubes that you see on the right side. And we then collected from the entire group the discussion and their notes and developed a direction for the project. The reason it was complex is it was the first time this organization was putting together, it's a kind of tripartite program that was new for them. It was venture capital, think tank, and incubator, all in one space that were meant to interact with one another. Of course, this is a qualitative bit of design for research, but in the end, it also has implications that are quantitative. In this case, the words that resulted from this was open, accessible, honest, simple, life-affirming, focused, which all imply a sense of well-being and a connection to the larger environment. However, here's the contradiction. After all of that beautiful discussion and development of an ethos, this was the building that they had leased, which sort of contradicts all of their desires for the project. It was in an urban setting of a series of warehouses that were originally pig barns and then used for storage, but had, is there a pointer here? No. In any case, the two vertical lines at the bottom of the plan, there were embedded in the project an order, kind of an archaeology that had been lost because it had been covered up, which were basically access for light and air originally in the building. However, the building was boarded up. The Mass Commission for the Blind was using it. I guess they didn't think that they needed light, and this is what the space was like inside. It was a rabbit warren with relatively low ceilings. One of the basic principles for us in this project was finding ways to connect any of the users with the natural environment. Not just a view out of a window, but to experience wind and rain and anything else that might, and snow that would come into to the larger environment. But the problem was a deep, deep floor plate 90 feet away from light and air. And so we just, in a sense, uncovered the existing order. We removed what was there and replaced it with glass, 2 6-foot wide by 100-foot long courtyards that put anybody in any position about 25 feet away from the environment. And then the tripartite plan on the left, bottom left side is the venture capital, the center is the think tank space with some associated offices, and then the L shape around it is the incubator space. And in this case, I'm going to actually focus on part of the issue here was how to compress the program. This is the result of the incision of these 2 courtyards into the space to create a kind of opening for it. Oh, thank you. I didn't see it. The problem with and again, one of the conflicts between the desires of the owners and the space required was a regulatory restriction. In this area, there was a building moratorium at the time we were building. And so some of the spaces that they required simply wouldn't fit. And then expanding the real estate lease was complex for them and expensive. This was the second round of interviews, which was meant to be a quantitative one, which in some ways reaffirmed and expanded on the ethos of the client, and it focused on function, the relationships between function, proximity, synergy, technology, and social order or social hierarchy within the project. So these were distributed and filled and then interpreted by us. So in the acts of compression, of which there were many, one of them was to take these 3 requirements of a library and the think tank and auditorium, which are just represented by these blocks in terms of their relative sizes, and combine them through the research that we had done on functionality of the rooms. We understood ultimately that none of these were going to be used simultaneously. And so it afforded the opportunity to collapse these into one space, basically, and then spun off a bunch of other problems. The size of table that they required for the engineers was much larger than we could get in and out of the room. The solution to this was to create a room, and that the table you see is just an industrial design aside that was in response to allowing this to work. We basically did, by combining these, we had to do two things. The size requirements were different. So what you see in the center is the think tank space where 12 engineers sit and imagine the future. On the outsides of them, combined with circulation space, are 30-foot long, 6-ton walls that carry the books. So in trying to solve this problem, we had an idea about just moving the walls, right? And creating a larger space, an auditorium for 100 people. In any of these events, Thank you. In any of these events, the folks who would be involved in the think tank would necessarily be involved in any of these presentations, so there was no need to duplicate the spaces. In researching possibilities here, we just looked at known systems of moving books. Really? Wow, okay. He said my hair's out of place. So we looked at systems like this, which wouldn't work for us because of the tracks on the bottom. We developed an inverted system for that to move the wall out of the way. And then this just gives you an idea of functionally how there was an industrial design component and how it transforms into an auditorium. In terms of the boathouse, we were confronted with a situation where we were going to contain 42% of the boats and rowers that are on the Charles River. However, our site footprint was intensely narrow and constrained. The solution involves the large building for the long boats, a glass building that is basically a billboard for the highway of boats, and a public court in between. I'm going to go through this very quickly. The other issue was the context of boathouses on the river, for which the client rejected at the get-go because they wanted to represent a non-elitist function, essentially a access to public rowing. This is sort of like the YMCA for rowers, and a first for Boston and in many places. So other research, and I'm not going to go through these, but other research involves working with engineers because one of the issues of a long building is drawing the boats. And this is what I'm going to just focus on that as a couple of items of research. But it involved, computational fluid dynamics, wind analysis, et cetera, et cetera. And then the development of various systems, including a geothermal well that maybe we can talk about later in terms of how the presentation of the information was made to the client in two different ways that incited a decision, a positive one rather than a negative one, which was initially negative. So we were inspired by a couple of mostly known things. A tobacco barn, which is a long building that dries tobacco, hangar doors so we could get the boats out the narrow ends of the building, and then the billboard, which was meant to be glass, a Pilkington type system that would allow air to flow through glass. And basically, the glass building is missing here, but in any case, it's a configuration, it's about skin on top of what is essentially a warehouse building. So these are the developments. The Pilkington was much too expensive. It's a relatively modest budget project. So we developed a different way of assembling the glass and allowing air to flow through both underneath and between the panes by extruding clips so that we could cut them up instead of machining them or casting them. And that's the result. So we get our billboard to the highway for the small boats. The inspiration from the hangar doors got us thinking about how the skin might be entirely dilated to allow air to move through the building and dry the boats. But we developed a rather low-cost aluminum system that allowed for doors that don't need to open as far up as a hangar door would. Again, the components here was a rather lengthy design so that both of these went through the same extrusion. One piece is cut off on this one and then flipped over so that one extrusion works as both the moving part and the receiving part, which gets us this, a building that literally changes form. This is actually a retrofitted hangar door then. It's modified slightly. And in the case of the louvers, the function was to protect the south wall, to cool the south wall, to allow air to escape from the hangar side, to also mask windows on the locker rooms that were facing the parking lot. And how to do that to get a kind of precision in architecture that would be similar to a crafted building, but understanding that those who would be building it would be installers, not craftsmen. So while these are very simple pieces, the development of those had everything to do with, again, extrusions that were cut, but allowing movement in this direction, vertically, horizontally in the clip direction, and then twisting in the tube direction that would allow perfect installation. There was even the development of a small tool that fit into the slotted hole here that then forces the screw to go into the middle, so that it's really an unskilled laborer that can install and achieve that kind of detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. The next speaker is David Ma. David is principal and founding partner of Ascensio Ma, a multidisciplinary design collaborative active in the design of architecture, landscape design, master planning, interior design, and installations. The firm's recent projects include Surface Deep, an experimental moss garden wall in Grand Métis, Quebec, and Q House, an exercise in maximizing views and daylighting over a parcel in northern Spain. David.
Okay, so I guess when I was first invited to the conference, I was a little bit perplexed because in many ways I found it very hard to be able to say that I have a consistency, like a deliberate consistency in the way that we practice and the things that we do. You can see in the last two speakers there's a very clear consistency, one looking very specifically at material research and another one who's really looking very closely at architectural issues. But for some reason or other, this is just a general list of things that somehow we've, both Lady Ascensio and myself, who are both parts of Ascensio Ma, have had to do over the number of years. And you know, it reads almost as if it's a kind of CV for someone with ADD, I guess, to some extent, like really like a mixed bag of all sorts of things, everything from stage set design right up to airport and landscape master planning consultancy strategies. I mean, these are legitimately things that we've been asked to do even as Ascensio Ma. So within the practice, for us at least, it was hard to be able to articulate a consistency, but perhaps maybe all of those conflicting issues that we've had to deal with maybe is a kind of consistency in itself. But also if we were to look at maybe academia in terms of our teaching and research as a refuge, as a space to be able to look very specifically and myopically at a specific issue, that's also been something that to some extent hasn't played out for us. If you look specifically at all the issues that we've had, the departments we've had to look and programs we've had to teach in, we've ranged from everything from architecture, landscape architecture, and even a little cameo in the graduate real estate program at Cornell. So, you know, it's really like a mixed bag of things that we've had to do. So within that context, I guess to some extent, being able to present an explicit, focused research that is very disciplinary specific is something that I can't promise that, you know, we can do through our work. But what we actually want to do in this case is to show how this inconsistency or this basically forced interdisciplinarity actually provided us with a kind of approach, let's say a research approach to look at different aspects of the things that we might encounter. So I think to some extent the presentation has to some extent be biographical. A lot of these things happen to some extent as a result of serendipity, I guess, to some extent. So in principle, when we started practicing as Ascensio Ma, we were at the time teaching in London at this program, a postgraduate program called Landscape Urbanism at the Architectural Association. And we were really focused at looking at the issue of the city, the wider kind of territorial issues, and also looking at a way that we can actually address those in a systemic manner, but in systemic manners that actually integrated issues of adaptation, working with site and all those issues. And this image we put up here of Ildefonso Cerdá, which really shows when the 19th century idealized grid meets topography and it forces the systemic change, is something that we were really interested in as an operation. We were also at the time very interested in looking at how new kinds of media would actually inform that search, I guess, that research. And also later on, basically informing strategies at a larger scale and landscape scale and how you might actually territorialize based on kind of adaptive techniques. Now, this culminates, I guess, to some extent. This is also just to show you the kind of things that we got asked to do. So in this case, this is an exhibition that was done by the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York recently to celebrate their 30-year anniversary, I think. And they basically invited 150 plus architects to really take an existing New York plan and rethink it. So we were given the Magan and Goerke plan, and we thought this was the perfect example to actually take all of that, say, hard work and research that we had incubated at the AA and try and use this as a forum to kind of be polemical with it, I guess. So the Magan and Goerke plan basically is an early plan that was a kind of survey that the city gave to these people called Magan and Goerke. And what it actually did in this case was, beyond just surveying the existing conditions, it actually used it as an opportunity to project how Manhattan might grow further north from its existing condition. And you can see in this case, it really was it was a bit different to the governor's grid in the fact that it wasn't an imposition of an idealized or optimized condition, but it really was trying to work with existing alignments, existing orientations, and together weave together a kind of resulting whole from that. We tried to use it, remembering that this was an exhibition where we told us you could only spend 10 hours on the drawing, and it could only be done with one drawing. So we tried to make it as let's say, basically as explanatory or expressive as possible. So what we did was to actually look at the possibility of presenting an alternative Manhattan, urbanization of Manhattan that took into account all the kind of existing qualities prior to its urbanization, looking at basically at the watersheds patterns and the kind of topography as inputs to drive, to drive the grid in many ways. And it basically gave us something that unintentionally was to some extent shocking, but it becomes a kind of polemic device to basically talk about, when you are addressing the issues of adaptation, in many ways you go away from the issues of optimization. You're really talking about, adaptation actually does produce very specific, very idiosyncratic moments in a kind of organization, and we thought that was an interesting way to describe it through this manner. Another thing, and then another forum that we actually, in a different way, we were able to kind of deal with the issue to some extent of adaptation was in this kind of single-family house project that we were commissioned around the same time as teaching in London in the north of Spain. This is for a new, basically, urbanization in the periphery of this town in north of Spain. And you can see it's a pretty generic subdivision. It's just a kind of equally divided parcels, and all the buildings basically fill out their setbacks and consolidate them as a single volume. In our particular case, because with all of these kinds of things that you're doing at the same time, it can't help do something to you in terms of the way that you approach the design process. And in this case, rather than looking at this purely from the building purely as a kind of result of the molding of an object, we wanted to work directly from the existing given condition of the landscape, I guess, to some extent. Work with the landscape, almost treat the building as a way of adapting to the landscape. So actually, if you look at when you look at it from the top, it's very hard to read, but actually there's a significant topography in the site. Basically there's a 6 meter grade difference that's roughly 20 feet between the upper corner of the site down to the lower end of the site. And for us, but typically what they do in these subdivisions, as you can see, is they simply level out the parcel and they consolidate the building as much as they can into a volume. And basically that's the result of it. And actually the interesting thing to think about it is also that within the context of Spain, these are all architect design houses. In Spain, you can't build a house without an architect, right? 5 minutes, okay. So what we did in this case was to really look at working with the ground to basically play with the 6 meter difference and use that as a way to actually organize the program of the house. So in this case, there's a grade change from the top right down to the bottom, and it basically reconfigures itself into a series of terraces rather than leveling out the whole parcel into a flat plane. Also, accordingly, the building also needs to basically accommodate the program would also need to kind of position itself in many different points on that shifting topography. And this is the kind of resulting organization that comes out of that. So what we want to, and is basically this plan is probably not the most accurate, but it also shows you the progression as you move up through the house, basically a progression that works with the topography, as all of these volumes are sitting on different levels of the site, basically. So these are some sections that show that. And you can see here actually what actually you produce is, rather than distinct levels, you produce a series of split levels that allow for interesting continuities through the building vertically, and also we try to orchestrate quite explicitly continuities between the landscape and the interior. So you can see these are some of the views of that. And what we try to do very explicitly by working with the topography is to kind of create these different platforms and different distinct parts of the garden within which there could be a dialogue or collaboration with the interior of the house. This is a view from the street and some detailed views of that. So there was basically a hunch that that working with landscape in a very explicit way and working with a kind of an ambition to adaptation could produce a new kind of type, I guess, to some extent, or at least a new approach to the issue of the suburban house in this subdivision. These are some details, but yeah, just show them. And in many ways, I guess the question of how these things inform each other, we also wanted to start basically in parallel to working. We also taught in this case, and this was a particular moment where we actually moved to the United States, and we started to be offering upper level, graduate level research studios. And in this case, we were very interested in this issue of the suburban house, and also the way in which basically a much more concerted, focused collaboration between looking at the volume of the building and the way that it works with the parcel boundary, or basically the plot, could actually yield more interesting, let's say, lifestyle platforms or more interesting configurations, was something that we wanted to look. So at the time that we first came to the United States, we started to look at, for us, what probably was the epitome of the lifestyle economy center, which is Las Vegas. So we started to look very specifically at a number of, and we had a research studio that really looked closely at the mechanics of how lifestyle is arranged either in a neighborhood. So this is, Las Vegas, this is called a neighborhood, and that's called a community, right? The difference between a community and a neighborhood is the neighborhood is optimized, the community has value added with landscape, right? So we also started to look very explicitly at the types of, look at the market products and looking at how they work with the landscape. So for us, this was basically something that I think was valuable for us, for the studio, and also for us as a kind of research basis for subsequent projects that we also did. I mean, for the students, it was something that they valued greatly, and they basically got a lot out of it. And for us, it also became valuable in terms of approaching specific projects. So this is a project where we now move to Australia, and this is a totally different context from Spain. In this case, you don't need architects to do houses. In fact, you don't need an architect, you actually need an engineer if you're doing a house. So this is a totally different context. And everything, most of the time in Australia, everything is done with standard products. So we were basically commissioned to look at a single family house, but being told quite explicitly that we should actually look very closely at the way standard products are made so that we can match prices and also meet expectations. Time up, okay. So in principle, we started looking very explicitly at the kind of ways in which standard house products are constructed in Australia, and they're very simple issues. They basically maximize, well, let's say looking at planning, the relationship to the plot boundary, it's basically maximizing your volume into a compact, let's say compact volume, and whatever landscape that's produced is simply a consequence of what's left over. So we try to work with a kind of form that actually works. You can see a lot of these kind of corrugated edges, which were actually ways for them to frame certain relationships to the landscapes, but in very, very, let's say, timid ways, and we try to make that a very explicit move in this case. So rather than trying to maximize and saying all the value is in the interior and the landscape is simply left over, we try to kind of increase the perimeter area ratio in this case and produce a kind of figure that would actually more explicitly frame different aspects of the landscape, and also make that a more explicit relationship between interior and exterior in the formal configuration. And the other thing that was also kind of interesting in this particular project was also, all of a sudden halfway through it, they came in basically a form-based code which is related to kind of environmental performance that actually said that every single exterior wall had to have an overhang attached to it. And that's not, it's different from a performance-based code, which actually means that you could simply beef up the insulation or do something with the material of the envelope. But in this case, it was very explicit. It was all driven by a kind of a preconception of what the construction industry typically pumps out. And also, to some extent, even architecturally, our only famous architect in Australia is Glenn Murcutt, and I guess to some extent their idea of ecology and sustainability is embedded within this kind of formal logic. So for us, it became very difficult because we were very interested in actually this continuous volume. So these are some little tricks that we tried to do to play with this idea of accommodating these new guidelines. But I think to some extent that also for us sparked an interest in perhaps codes, how codes can actually be a kind of, I don't know if this is a creative response to it, but how codes actually become something that you have to negotiate with in terms of developing form, I guess, to some extent. Maybe I won't go through all of this. Do I have time? No, I don't have time? Okay, so basically these are different projects that I guess to some extent informed later the later kind of research studios, which were really looking at the issue of type and the relationship between, let's say, a building type and in the way that it might sit within its boundary, in this case, the grid. This was something that we looked at. And we also, you know, I guess I can't get to this point, but I was basically going to start talking about the object part of the talk. But okay, should I just flash the images? Okay, I'll just flash the images. So these are various things that we've been doing at Harvard, which this is later Essencio's class on refabricating tectonic prototypes. These are some of the things that we've done. And this is something that we did together with the GST. So in this case, I guess to some extent you could call this academic research, but it was a straight commission. And maybe we will have to leave the elaboration of this project to the discussion. But you can ask me questions about it during the talk. But this was something that we did together with students at the GSD, and we were really looking at, it was for a garden festival, and basically they invited us back again the second time, and it was really a kind of the issue of considering landscape as a product, I guess, to some extent, looking at product design issues, and how these kind of products can actually form, interestingly enough, microecologies. And if you look at the form and read it not just in terms of what it produces as a kind of formal articulation, but look at it in terms of how it performs thermodynamically, it also produces microclimates. So actually the form of this was very explicitly the thing that helped us curate where certain species of moss would actually be located on that surface. So, you know, it basically is that. Yeah, so sorry about that. Okay.
Thank you, David. So now to the discussion. So please, speakers, take your seats. The discussion will be led by Paul Nakazawa. Paul works internationally as a practice and business advisor to firms in the design fields. He's one of the founders of AMO, the research and development arm of OMA, and chairs Snøhetta's board of advisors.
Great. Wonderful. Three really interesting and different kinds of things. So moderating this kind of panel where you have such diverse interests is a challenge. And, you know, from where I sit as someone who tries to help practices develop their agendas and extend them, I mean, I find all of you extremely interesting as types of practices that represent a kind of a new vector in terms of where practice can go. And interestingly enough for me, all of your practices extend them, well, they both disrupt perhaps and extend the disciplinary discussion about what is architecture. And I think that that's kind of one thing that I could say runs through all three of your things, which is it calls the question on disciplinary lines of what really can be considered architecture in the contemporary context, because there's been an ongoing kind of split, I would say, between people who say, well, there's the discipline and there's the practice, and then there's this kind of imaginary line in the sand. And for someone like myself who is engaged in teaching practice, not only professional practice, which means that's even more kind of specific, which is the legally authorized version of what practice is within the state mandate of licensure, versus practice as a notion of taking a discipline and deploying it. What are do you have any thoughts, gentlemen, on speculations on a wrestling of how you think your practices relate to disciplinary ideas? I mean, do you really feel that you're extending the discipline in terms of where you're going with it? And what I mean by discipline is also not related to a client per se. I mean, because all of us get wrapped up in practice in terms of the thing of our relationship to a client, or a relationship to a social cause or something like that. In all of your cases, you haven't been explicitly tying it that way. So David, I mean, the AA is great. I mean, I have to say that as a contrast to Harvard education, the AA is out there in terms of tackling things by any means. It's bricolage, it's theory. They take the whole range of things, and you're almost kind of like shameless in your pursuit of advancement, but somehow it's not so constrained by the walls, or this is theory, this is that, it's really like all of it, wham, you know. And then I go there every year and look at the diploma school, and it's always a trip. The first day I have no idea what I'm talking about, and I'm trying to get my arms around it, and then by the end of 3 days, I'm kind of captivated and enchanted. So,
well, to be honest, I haven't been back for quite a while, so I think
I understand, but I mean, but your practice of the kitchen sink,
Right.
you know, that's a very a cool way of practicing. I often tell that to my younger practitioners, is like now is the time for the kitchen sink.
Right.
It's like this kind of pick and choose is like the wrong time for you, and so I don't think you should be embarrassed by the kitchen sink. I think that's a legitimate strategy.
I mean, I think to some extent the fact that it exists there is to some extent is the way that it tends to be organized, and that you don't have necessarily specific modules that you have to meet. Like design studio is everything basically, I think. So typically they have either in the diploma it's a unit system, or in the graduate school the studio is 95% of what you do. And then if you do any courses, well, that it's usually 1 or 2 course maximum additional to studio. So basically, the reason why I guess you can approach a problem and try everything possible is probably maybe in those contexts it becomes everything that you do in the studio, and everything that you need to address, like technical issues, let's say practice issues. All of these things have to culminate in design studio, and quite often, because you have there's a year system there, so I guess it also gives you too much time sometimes. So you do throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at the problem, and that's probably just a consequence of the way that it's set up. That typically, you're given the time and the basically the scope to do that. And in our case, I think with the studio, with the practice, it's largely because. I don't want to just make it sound like it's completely an accident, but it is largely serendipity. I mean, we do just get all of these random requests to do things, and we just have to find somehow a way to kind of negotiate all of these things in a very quick way. I don't know if it's necessarily a consequence of the training, or it's a consequence of the circumstance that we get put into in that case.
Yeah, I mean, but innovation, the way innovation happens is not linear sequential. And so I think that one of the issues in practice is that because of the nature of practice in certain countries, especially in the United States, where the training of professionals follows a very utilitarian kind of logic that starts in reality and ends in reality, there's this kind of suspension of the real, but you're still grounded in a reality, but you're pushing the boundaries of things. So like the plan of New York, where you simply suspend the rules and some of the parameters and see what will happen. So this kind of, the innovative process comes out of this constant ability to suspend belief in certain parameters and then push the argument. And so this kind of constant testing, failure, redoing it. I mean, Edison would be happy with that kind of approach. You know, fail 100 times, and then you eventually get there. I mean, the same thing, Matt, with your practice. It seems it's directed but not directed. So you want to, on one hand, you're pushing classes of problems forward. You may or may not have a client for it. Hopefully, you do at some point, because otherwise you won't have a practice long. So someone has to pay you for it. But I mean, those classes of problem solving open up what would normally be considered a market for your services, rather than close them down, because it opens up a wider audience for work, rather than the traditional way in which professional practice is organized, which is in advanced economies, so-called, so targeted to services and markets that the parameters actually are choking off possibility. So, you know, all of you are engaged in somehow opening up spaces through suspension of certain parameters, and it's it's potentially costly in terms of manpower, in terms of your own engagement. So,
is this on?
Yeah.
From my perspective, it's a kind of, maybe a little bit of naivete,
Yeah.
but it's a kind of self-confidence that any regulation, any requirement, any contingency, as I said earlier, is interpretable. And I think in some ways it is our training, because we find that unless, for example, a client on a commercial project is working with the very best branding agency, let's say, they'll always run it by us. So what do you think? And, you know, 4 weeks later, we're working on the branding exercise. And so our tendency now, rather than, at least with a small practice, I think, and most of my colleagues tend to do this, is rather than reject work on a, you know, on a cover yourself basis, right, which is another way of practicing.
Right.
It's to do exactly the opposite and develop a kind of position where you're the go-to person for all problems, whether they happen to be design issues with a corporeal result, or they are other kinds of design issues that have to do with processes and otherwise.
And traditional research, the way a scientist or other would be, kind of this persistence over time. So someone keep track of time for me, but this persistence of a class of issues that then you kind of do an exhaustive kind of investigation of certain classes of problems, and then you know, classic scientific stuff is it repeatable? Can other people get similar results by doing it? None of what you're doing seems to be in that model.
Right. I brought an article that it's actually just a portion of an article. We were looking a lot at other models of research for sort of parallel industries and how they incorporate research into the business of making, of contributing to the built environment. And this is an article that was published in 2011 by Kaomi Goetz from Fast Company. It's pretty interesting. I'll just read you a small portion of it. It says, in 1974, 3M scientist Art Fry came up with a clever invention. He thought if he could apply an adhesive dreamed up by colleague Spencer Silver several years earlier to the back of a piece of paper, he could create a perfect bookmark, one that kept his place in the church hymnal. He called it Post-it Note. What you might not know is that Fry came up with the now iconic product through his, quote, 15% time, a program at 3M that allows employees to use a portion of their paid time to chase rainbows and hatch their own ideas. It might seem like a squishy employee benefit, but the time has actually produced many of the company's best-selling products and has set a precedent for some of the top technology companies of today, like Google and Hewlett-Packard. 3M launched the 15% program in 1948. And I think this program is actually highly problematic in the context of architecture, but it's still a very useful one. Basically programming research into the process of your practice. And I think we can't do that because everything is so disjointed and random, and clients' needs on one project are very, very different from the other project. But at the same time, we can take a similar approach of sort of mandating, putting a burden of research on the office that actually helps the office have a framework for making decisions and creating some kind of cohesion and consistency despite the differences from project to project.
Another way of looking at that, and I think we're among architects, so we can say this without exposing ourselves, but isn't that all we do?
Right.
15 minutes? In some ways, I feel like that's what we're engaged in all the time.
Right.
Right.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Are there questions or comments from the audience at this point? Do you want us to keep talking? We can keep talking. Anyone?
Hi, thank you for your presentations. I'm wondering if the topic of the relationship between research and design affected, or maybe the question is, how did it affect the way you presented projects that you showed today? Because I presume you've presented them in other contexts as well.
Do you want to? Someone wanted to take that. David.
Well, I mean, certainly, when you asked to present in a forum, and you're asked to present your work, it does, if there's a specific request, in this case there was a specific question, it does force you to try and recontextualize your work in a certain way. In many ways, I think it's true that when I started looking at the work, I was trying to find a very strong, consistent theme, because at least initially your assumption is that research is something that you're looking very consistently for. But I found actually what was quite consistent in it was actually the capability to basically look at a lot of other disciplines to inform the project. So that was the consistency, rather than a consistent, let's say, theme. So it was actually, for me, it was actually a very informative exercise to actually be forced to look at your own work and try and address the question in this way. So yes, I mean, to some extent, I've had to rethink the work in the light of this thing, which. But on the other hand, I'm not sure it doesn't mean that it was not conscious. I guess to some extent it was conscious. When you were doing the process, it's just trying to make it explicit in the talk,
What's also, I think, different about some of the research you guys are doing is that you're not adjunct to a client. Because I think in the case of AMO, when we started the firm, we were part and parcel of certain clients who had very specific needs, so that we could identify in advance a scope of work, a price, a trajectory for that research. So we were never at risk for payment on a lot of that. So the initial life of AMO was assured in the sense that we had key commissions that were part and parcel of Prada or other projects ongoing, where we could identify the content areas and the specific outcomes that were being sought. This is you guys are engaged in slightly different models, where you're bringing your own kind of intellectual capital and skills and work methodologies to clients that may or may not have been looking for you. And I think that that's a different model of practice, one probably which is better suited for the contemporary condition, since there are very few people who can simply ride with, as co-pilot to a major company and build it that way. It's probably more interesting.
Yeah, I will say that it seems that it is fundamentally important to think of research proactively as part of the practice rather than passively. I don't think anyone's saying that research just sort of happens like it's an accident in the office. Right. It is something that needs to be sort of dedicated in some manner of speaking. And I think the reason that that's so important is because it gives us a way of discerning its value. Without that, it becomes just sort of part of the general process. And I think research is actually a component of process, not parallel or equal to process.
Yeah, I would agree with that, even from purely a method of working perspective, because I think what you were showing, for example, what is an unusual condition that is becoming more usual in terms of digital practice. And so I think when you spent $100 on a fine parallel bar and a couple of tools that you used for your whole life, your methodology was not fixed, but it was narrowed. So putting aside all of the other scales and kinds of research, just in terms of the tools that we use, you're constantly engaged in research. Otherwise, you would
Right.
lose ground with the tools.
Absolutely. Are there any other questions from the audience at this point?
Just very quickly, one thing that I recently, we've started to have a little bit of contact and meet some scientists, I guess material scientists recently. We were quite astounded because we always thought that there was a very clear, like you make a hypothesis, I'm going to try and make a metal that's very ductile. But actually what they do a large chunk of the time is just really try stuff, like randomly try things, and then basically whatever sticks happen that seems to have an application is something that they pick up. Of course, we're talking about an institute which is, well funded and all that, but it was something that basically was quite surprising that they actually approached it to some extent almost like designers. I guess to some, they didn't have a specific goal. It was just randomly material.
It would be interesting if the culture of architectural practice globally were to actually flip more into this mode of behavior, because you would then have basically thousands and thousands of people tinkering with different aspects of design and how that maps into other agendas socially and politically. I mean, whether it's sustainability or whatever. The running of these large experiments, the betting the ranch on these big kind of projects, I think is not an efficient way forward. It's a very risky way forward. There are big losers in terms of if things fail, if you put that kind of money up and bet the ranch on something. So that this kind of constant pursuit of classes of problems, which in and of themselves may be limited, but then when at some point it will come together where you have kind of resonance of all these different experiments, that will actually add up to something much bigger if we can just move the culture of practice forward. I think that will result in something quite interesting.
We're sort of having to, the controlled chaos is sort of what we're having to do in a sense, if for no other reason because of the economic paradigm that we've found ourselves in this past 5-6 years.
Absolutely. I think we're on time. Yes? Okay. Thank you.